Hey folks, I am super excited to be here with you all today, and we're going to be getting started here in just a minute or two. So before we do the official start and, I'll make it sound really official and, professional, I guess, I thought, hey, well, I'll just jump on here and say hi to everybody as you guys are coming on in. And so we're going to get started. I see a couple people already on. A few people already have posted in the comments or the chat box. Feel free to say hi. It really is encouraging to me to see everybody who was on to be able to participate, and hopefully this. Well, let me just say this. So let's start with. I get ahead of myself sometimes because I get so excited about these trainings. I love these trainings. First, I guess we'll say maybe you can post on there where you are from, what country you're from, not your address. That'd be personally identifiable information, so we don't want to do that. Hey, Simon, Yadish, Manov, Kazi, and Tat. Very nice to have all of you here. I am, there we go. My computer, and I'm like crazy. My computer, when I put it down like this, it has to be just the right angle, but anyways. Joseph, there we go. Austin's good to have you, everyone on here, and I'm excited to talk about databases today. There's quite a few concepts that are not well understood, and I hope to clear up some of this to make it, well, if nothing else, a place that I can reference back to when giving some of these suggestions, but also to provide some jumping off points for those of you who are a little more senior. I know Joseph Leedy and Simon are two of you that I've specifically interacted with that are on this conversation here that definitely are a little more senior. So to be frank, it is tough. It is a little bit tough because I want to provide stuff that's like relevant for everybody, but doing that in real time in a conversation is always a little tricky. Oh, hey, Alex, Puerto Rico, nice. Oh, Kazi's from Bangladesh. I like that. Very nice. All right, so I suggest we just go ahead, jump on in. I know there's going to be more people that are going to filter in now, and we'll just jump in and get started. Vietnam, yes, awesome. All right, so I'm going to do an official introduction screen because then we'll chop off this beginning here. So then those of you who are watching after the fact, you won't have to watch through my preamble like this. So, all right, we're going to go ahead and get started with our ninja training number 3. Welcome to Ninja Training number 3, September 2021. I am super excited to be here with you all today as we talk about databases and especially focusing on the performance side. Now, I will give a caveat right here up front that I am not a database performance expert from the MySQL side. I know some about it using the MySQL Query Tuner. Those are... that's a very helpful tool there. But I am not an expert as far as master and slave replications and all that stuff. Like, that is totally out of my league, and I will 100% say that up front. That's not my deal. But it has been very important to me to focus in on how can I, on the software side, optimize my queries as much as possible. And so the goal today here is to walk you through what you can do to write performance queries to get information from the database as quickly as possible. And as I'm thinking about it, there was one thing I forgot that I wanted to mention. So I'm going to write this down here very quickly. And that is the use of explains in SQL. So we'll see if I can remember to get back to my note here and cover that here in a little bit. All right, so let's jump into our conversation here. Oh, where did my there we go. Okay. I was looking at the wrong screen. All right. So I fielded a lot of questions about the database and how does this work? What can we do to get information out of it? And some of the questions are on the basic level, such as when to use a resource model or collection or a repository. What's the purpose of a model in this case? Why can't we just call model save? And so I'm going to go through the basics of it. So I think the first half is going to be a little more basic. And so those of you folks that are on upper mid-level to senior, you probably don't have to pay that much attention. I'll still try to give you some good or insights or some good thoughts, and feel free to chime in on stuff as well. I love this to be a conversation, not necessarily me just talking to everybody. So my goal is to cover some of the basics of the databases, the ideas behind it, because I think that's going to be the launching board for going forward as we look to understand how we can do this in a performant manner. Let me just put it this way. Writing an effective query in MySQL, for example, that's pretty much the only language Magento utilizes. I mean, it could use others, but it really never does. Writing a query is almost always faster than using code to do the same thing. And I say almost always. There are some cases in which it isn't, and I hope to talk about some of those cases in the future. But for right now, just keep in mind that if we were to do, for example, we needed to do a loop and work through a list of products, and maybe for every product we need to load a little extra piece of information from the database. By writing that into a query, we're hitting the database that many less that number of times fewer, and that results in better performance overall. So there's usually different ways to approach problems, as opposed to just, for example, using a product repository, calling the get method on there. There's usually different ways to do that, and that's what I hope to explore and to focus in. So let's look at the big picture here. The big picture is that Magento utilizes what's called the active record pattern. And while this sounds like a fancy term, it really isn't a fancy term. It's an idea it's the term that embodies the code that we probably write all day, every day. And that is that the information from the database is stored in a class, an object, and that class or that object can also save or manipulate the data as it goes into the database or comes back out of the database. And the reason I put the word anti into here is that Magento, while it has started with this idea, and Magento 1 pretty heavily relied on this idea, it's getting more decoupled from this idea. So the active record pattern is still somewhat active in that calling product set name is a good idea. That's where we have a model that stores information in it, but that model is not used to save itself to the database or load itself back from the database. Instead, just throwing out an example here, we have what's called a product repository. And this repository, as we see, is kind of like the overarching mechanism to get information from the database or save information to the database. Now, there is nothing spectacular or nothing magical about a product repository in this case, and we'll talk very specifically about what a product repository is, other than it's more or less a wrapper for accessing or saving information from or to the database. So what I hope to illustrate here in these 3 lines of code is the fact that we are focusing in on specific uses for each one of these classes. A product model in this case, or a data model, the goal of it is just to store information in memory. That's all it does. But instead, the product repository, the goal of that is to push away our view of the access of this data. The product repository can save information, it can load information, and we really don't care where it saves it to, where it loads it from. The product repository is all we have to access, and we get this information through that product repository. So that's kind of the big picture as far as from the single responsibility principle. So no longer should you ever call, load, or save on a given data object or data model, one that extends abstract model. Instead, you should utilize other tools to do that. Whether it's a repository, you could get very granular and use a resource model. You could also use a collection to load information. We'll talk about each one of these tools here in a minute. But here is the basic idea. So taking the repository out of this, I want to just focus on more of the database aspect of this, and then we'll add in the repository to show you how it kind of tucks away all these queries, so you don't really have to worry about what's actually happening behind the scenes. But then again, if you're building your own model, you have to worry about this. So that's why we want to be talking about exactly what to do here. So this is our database here. Over on the left side, we see this little stack of cylinders, which is the typical image for a database. And we have our resource model. The resource model is responsible for directly interacting with the database. It's what immediately hides our perspective of the database from us. I say hides, or it abstracts it. It makes it so that we don't have to, on normal operations, directly interact with the database. So we can call the resource model, we can call load, we can call save on the resource model, and Magento takes care of all of that for us. The collection, on the other hand, is responsible for loading a list of objects. It loads a list of objects, and then it creates, well, it loads the data from the database, and it creates a new model, or a new data model, as we see here in this little model. I'll scoot over to the side here. We see the model here. It creates a new one of those for every value or every new row that is returned. Now, the resource model is a little bit different in that it does not create a new model. It does not ever create a new model. In fact, when we call load, we need to call the factory first, pass in this new blank empty object, and we call load, we pass in this new blank empty object, this new model, this object, and then the resource model adds this information to it. And that's one of the reasons why it's important to use the abstract model, the abstract DB, and the abstract collection classes respectively, so that we can take advantage of these low-level functions that Magento handles for us. Outside of that, we can add whatever we want to any of these classes. However, it's important to understand the purposes of each one of these classes. So the factory creates the model. Pretty much never have to touch the factory, although you can create your own custom factories. I don't think I've ever done that for creating a new data model. I've done it for some other cases, but not actually for a new data model. The model should have, as we'll talk about here in a second, should have getters and setters only. I'll talk about why that is. The resource model, you could leave it empty, but I have found it incredibly helpful and performant to tuck my queries into there that don't necessarily relate to loading full rows of information, but instead load in, for example, an array of IDs or an associative arrays. One little note here is I find when we start getting into the fetch all method, and we'll talk about specifically what that is basically it returns a multi-dimensional array. So you have key of 0, and then inside 0 we have an array of every column and the value that's associated with it. I find we start, just me personally, and this is very much opinion, we start getting into a perspective of just dealing with arrays. So does this column actually exist? Are we in sync here? There's no common contract wherewith we can understand what's happening. A single column array, that's very well defined. A key value array, very well defined. But when we start getting into multiple columns, like say 3 or more, at that point, it becomes really fluid. And at that point, it's probably better to use a collection, but there could be some cases to use a fetch all. All right, a couple questions or comments that are coming in here. Make sure that we catch up on these. So Tat says, and forgive me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, where should we write the query and where should we not write it? Okay, so in a very brief nutshell, we want to write the query in either resource model or collection. Your queries will go into one of those. That's where they're going to go, period. No other place than those two places. The collection, the queries you will put in there are to possibly add extra columns, and we'll talk about the pros and cons to that. I see a lot of cons, but that would be a place to add information to pulling back a list of rows. But the resource model is, in my experience, well, I think I'm trying to be generous here when I say 80% of my queries go into the resource model, but in my experience, it's usually like 95+% of all of my queries go into the resource model. And again, my queries usually result in 1 or 2 columns output. One column meaning just an array of hopefully an integer or something like that, or a associative array where you have a key and a value that is returned out of this. So that's pretty much that is what I use the resource model for. Of course, we have to use it to load information out of the database, like load specific row, save information, or delete information. That's kind of the basic level, but beyond that, I find it very performant to add my SQL queries in there. And again, when I say SQL queries, I am not talking about just writing in there, select whatever from whatever, etc. I'm talking about using the Magento's ORM implementation, which is kind of, it works. It gets the job done. Let's just put it that way. So, at the end of the day, that's what I end up using to get the information out of the database. All right, so hopefully that answers your immediate question there, Tat. Simon, the idea is not to write queries at all, but to use the database classes to abstract away the details of the SQL query. Absolutely. But then again, I also feel like, so we can do everything. Well, we can eliminate some queries by just running commands in our code, right? We can do a for each loop and inject extra information into a class through the for each loop and multiple queries. However, if we can combine it together and the code still reads nice and and we save a lot on performance, I'm always going to do that, take that approach, because again, my approach is, the whole famous Amazon study, right? If you 1 second costs, I don't know how many thousands of dollars of extra load time, or I think it was a tenth of a second. It's insane how much page speed affects performance. And so at every single step of my journey, I am constantly watching the performance of this. And there's one time in the last year that I wrote add attribute to select with an asterisk in there, meaning selects all attributes. And I still have a to-do comment in there because I am going to go back in there and change it out. It'll take me a little extra time to do that. All right. Okay, so worked with some members of Adobe and saw them write queries in the model. So I'd be very surprised if it was in the data model, so i.e. found in the module /model / right inside of there. It probably was found inside the resource model. Now, if it was found directly inside the model, I'm going to push back on that. I just cannot see in any way how that would be even slightly good to do. What Willis is talking about. I'm not really sure what Willis is talking about, but what Willis is talking about, drop the question here. Should a repository handle caching or optional caching? It can. But the question is, why would it need to? And in a lot of ways, I think a caching is a Band-Aid because it's to cover over other performance problems. And the product repository is a glaring example of that. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more later. And so I'll table that conversation just a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Great. Let's keep moving. This is awesome. Thanks for the conversation. I love the conversation. This is great. All right. So jumping into now a repository. So the idea is the repository makes it so we personally don't have to understand what's happening in the resource model, what's happening in the collection. It kind of pushes all those details away. And if we want, we can add caching at this layer. The repository becomes a centralized place for example, plugins. And Magento has very much encouraged using plugins on the repository because it's, again, centralized. We can add plugins for the save, for before, after save, before get by IDs, whatever. There's a whole bunch of places that we can hook directly into the product repository. For example, I'm picking on that one because I definitely have a little bit of a beef with it. So that has also created a bit of a problem. Because then with the power that is associated with plugins, and I remember Ben Marks talking about this way back in the day, with the power that comes with all these plugins comes great responsibility, and yet, if I could say this, many module vendors just completely forget about performance. I mean, okay, if you install one bad module and then 10 good modules, you might not notice it. But the problem is if you then start putting 5 bad modules and 5 good modules, of course you're going to notice the poor performance. So the repository in an ideal world, and when I say in an ideal world, I'm not always talking about Magento because I wish I could say Magento was ideal, but it's just plain not. So in an ideal world, we would only use the repository. We would never touch, for sure, the collection. and we probably would rarely touch the resource model. Although, again, I maintain that the resource model is absolutely critical for, again, these one-off queries, returning one value, returning an array of values or array of associative values. That's where the resource model has great value, and a repository really could never touch it. Now, that said, I was having a conversation yesterday with somebody, and this brought up the topic I'm going to talk about next month. Again, as I talk about this ninja training, this is not necessarily something that I'm coming at you that I have all the answers. I am on a journey myself, and I love these trainings because it forces me to dive deeper into stuff, because when somebody can train on something, you know it much deeper. And so this is just one of the ways that I want to get myself better as a developer, is to be able to help you get yourself as developers. And when you guys start doing ninja trainings yourself, or I don't know, maybe we'll do a little more of a group type of approach here in the future. And if you have comments or topics, feel free to come on and share with me. Then I'd be really excited to open this up to others as well, because again, I am not the person with all the answers. I am a person who wants to learn all the answers, and that process is something I'll never get to the end of. So the repository is a way to abstract access out, so we don't have to see what's going on in the back end. Now, here's a couple of the methods that we often see in our classes. So our model, again, just to reiterate, model should only have getters and setters. That's it. If we start adding more to a data model, i.e. something that is loaded from the database, I view it as a code smell. Yes, I understand Magento does that. It's pretty common, but it's a code smell because we are violating the single responsibility principle. For example, if we have a method in there called getImageURL, and that getImageURL means we have to load in a scope config so that we can get the media directory, or however we do this. It's store manager. I think maybe it's store manager, or the URL store manager, I think. So we can get the media directory. We have violated the single responsibility principle. That getImage, we should just have a getImage method, which returns just the image path, and then we can set up a separate class of sorts, whether it's like a service. I love to use the term actions. These are little bite-sized pieces of business logic that basically take an action. So we would pass our image path, our image file name, into this action, which would then spit out the URL. Very simple. So we are keeping one single focus in on this data object. Now, if we come over to resource models, of course, if we extend, which we should be extending abstract DB, we can then add whatever methods we want to this. Sadly, I see many resource models being empty. I'm not saying that they should be chock full of 1,000 lines of code, but usually when it's empty, it means that the processing is happening elsewhere in PHP, as we don't always just need the full data object. There's many times that a simple join, a couple of joins, and we get one list of information out of there as just a column or associative array. And finally, the collection. I find that the methods that I would add into the collection are best used for like filtering and sorting, not necessarily for joining other information in, but that's the topic we will talk about at the end if we have time. And if we don't have time, then we will push this off into our conversation in November, which will also be a good one. I hope to continue exploring the database and continue my conversation that we are starting here today. So, repository should have several methods, and these are the basic methods that a repository should have. At the end of our conversation today, I will give you a link to the title of a DevDocs article, and in this article, it lists these four as what should always be in the repository. Now, there is no repository interface in Magento that I have seen, and particularly, I believe that's because the return types are going to be different. We should have everything should be type hinted on the method, so not using doc blocks. Get by ID should return a type of product interface, for example, and the way Magento chooses to do this is it throws a not found, no such entity exception. Personally, if I was writing repositories, I would suggest steering more toward a nullable type, and then we want to check to see if the return value is null or not. Because again, one thing just to say there is Magento says to not use an exception to affect business logic. So the value, this value is not found in the database. In my opinion, it fits better for a nullable return type as opposed to a throwing an exception. But either one gets the job done at the end of the day. So let's talk about models. Single responsibility principle. And you'll see this class name here. And this class is coming from my new project, which, to be frank, this is a bit of a sore spot for me right now because time-wise, I'm struggling with time. So I'm trying to get this project done. It's the Art of Ecommerce Debugging, the companion course for it. But then Magento came out with a new business practitioner test. That means I need to update my course, and that goes to the highest priority. So that's kind of how I've been operating my life here lately, is the highest priority. So this is the class path that we will see in the project. So I'm going to just jump over here and show you. Let's see here. This is model location. So we see in our directory here, we have product decorator, model, and we'll look at the location class. And inside here, we just have our getters and our setters. Now, one little trick, and actually I did not do it on this location, but one little trick, I'm working toward coming out with several modules I think that are going to be some great utilities for you as you write code yourself. But actually, I think it's under help. No, it's not. Strict type trait. This is a tiny little utility that allows us to return, to affect the data that's going out of our getters. And so in this case, we can use this strict type trait. And I know using traits can be dangerous, but in a case like this, we are wanting to bring in a helper method that's very close and intimate with our model. And so by bringing this in, we can return a nullable int or nullable float. Those are my two favorites right here. And this return, so basically it's in keeping with if there's a value that's being passed from the database that's null, which means that it's not been set, versus 0 through infinity, which means that we do have a value for it. So it's different ways to treat a value. So making sure that we keep in coordination with that, and with that coming out of the database, this strict type trait can be very helpful in that idea of thinking. So you'll see that right here. Actually, I'm not using it, but I could shorten this line of code up significantly by using this strict type trait. So at the end of the day, this model has just getters and setters. The only exception is, and this possibly should be in the resource model, is the before save. If there's no sort order, we're setting the sorter to be null. So, and I would very much argue as I'm looking at this should be in the resource model to make sure that we are. So basically, there's the sort order of 0 should never exist. It's either null or 1 or more. So this is a model. Very, very simple. All right, let's look at, so one thing to note is that the model should implement, and I'll show you this here real quick. Let's see here. It should implement abstract model. So I find this really easy to remember. Abstract model, abstract model for a model, abstract DB for a resource model, and abstract collection for the collection. So trying to remember those as you're going to create a new model, it makes it really, really fast. You can also extend abstract extensible model to facilitate extension attributes on the model that you're creating, and that can be super helpful as well. Okay, so let's jump in and talk about a collection. I think that's the next thing that would be pertinent. So a collection retrieves a list of models, and the methods, in my opinion, should either filter or sort. One thing to note is that group by can be very dangerous on a collection, although it seems necessary and helpful at some point, but it can cause a lot of problems. And the biggest problem I see, for example, if you added a group by to a product collection, you wanted to aggregate in, just throwing out an idea here, order numbers, or how many orders have been placed for this product. You could group it by that and then do a count of those orders. That wouldn't be very performant, but whatever. And the problem is if you don't use group by carefully or don't test it well enough, you will get or the product list. When you filter that down, it will show showing products 1 through 20 of all of the products that are available. So that the filtering doesn't work on the accounts, and that's in this get select count SQL. That's where it is. So that can be a bit dangerous there. So collections are helpful, but to be frank, I just don't find myself using, literally in this example project that I've built out, I don't think, and I was looking through that this morning, I haven't added a single method to the collection. Now, I think some of that's just me and my personal preference, and I'm sure some of you, the rest of you, like to use them all the time. And there are some cases to do it, but I just haven't found many cases to do this. So one thing to note, make sure you alias your stuff out so that you don't have crazy long, fully qualified names sitting around in your code. Okay. Yes, let's jump on. One thing to note that's for you that are a little bit more advanced is if you are creating extension attributes for a model of sorts, of any model. And extension attributes, by the way, are a great way to attach supplemental or extraneous information to a given data object. So you're not actually modifying the data array on an object. You are attaching this information in a browsable format. One thing to note is this get new empty item actually uses the entity factory interface to create a new class, a new model data object. So what that ends up doing is it does not call the model factory. It ends up calling entity factory interface, which then creates this model, which means that if you are using extension attributes, and one of my favorite things with extension attributes is to attach them to a given class when that class's factory's create method is called. So we have model factory, and then the create method, I create an after plugin for that to attach that extension attribute all the time. So it becomes more or less part of the code and always easily accessible. Well, when you're working with a data model, you want to also attach it to entity factory interface, which it's not that hard. You just would add that as a separate plugin. And then I hate to say this, but if you take out type hinting, and I did that, let me just show you. Do I have that here? No, maybe I do. Well, we take out basically type hinting on the plugin. Here's defaults. Nope, I don't have it here. I'm not in this project. So if you take out the defaults, if you take out the type hint on the after create method, you can attach it to both the entity factory interface as well as the model factory as well. But the one thing to keep in mind is the entity factory creates all models, all classes, so you want to have some type of filter there so you're not trying to apply this extension attribute to everything. What is Willis talking about? Is the trait code you mentioned showed on GitHub somewhere? No, not yet. But if you are part of our Slack community, swiftauto.com/Slack, I will post it there, and then I will drop that. I'll post it, and then I'll drop the link on our Slack community, to our Slack community. All right, a resource model. I love resource models if you haven't figured this out, simply because I feel like I can improve the speed of my operations significantly by working a little bit closer to the database. You want to be careful still that you're not writing poor code or poorly performing queries, but at the end of the day, I find usually it's better. And we'll talk about the explain statement in SQL so that you can see exactly how that works here in just a minute. But the nice thing one thing I do like about these is that I can type hint everything. I can return a method. I showed you a list of those earlier, and actually let me just make this very simple. I have get max colors by tier. This returns an array, and I do have a fetch all in here because we're looking to get tier ID, max colors, and min tier. So we have 3 columns we're returning. That would be an exception to my rule. I try to not use fetch all, but in this case, it really doesn't make sense to pass this down as through a collection in a model. but I need all three of these together, so I had to use fetch all. Get by ID, this more or less, and I should have a Boolean here, but this more or less just validates that this row exists in the database. It's more of a validation. We have a lookup. This returns a float, and we have a little bit of logic in here. One could argue, okay, should this logic actually be in an action, which would probably make a little more sense, or should it be in a repository? So I've left it in the repository because it's very well coupled together. We're getting the price off of this, and we are actually doing some iterations through this, but call it the real live version of this module. This module here is very stripped back and rewritten version, but it takes some of the very basic ideas of this other module that I've somewhat replicated. Get tier ID for. This is one of my favorite things to put in a resource model as far as like the starting out. You can abstract this out, so you could just say get value for and then pass in an ID and a column for the value. But we're just getting one value off of this. There's no reason to call a collection load or repository load. If we can just fetch one value off of this. Now, maybe it works just fine to call a repository. But for example, if your resource model needs just an ID, and it would not be a good idea to inject a repository into this resource model, but maybe two methods in this resource model need the tier ID for this given row, well, then this really does start making sense. And you can then sprinkle it through the rest of your code if you want to, but at the end of the day, using a repository in the rest of your code probably makes more sense. But here in a resource model, this can be a great way to abstract, to centralize functionality here. So this is an example of a resource model. We have a number of them. Here in this case, we're returning an array, 2 columns. And let's see here. And this one, again, array of 2 columns. Yep, here's a great one. Fetch column. And one thing to remember is if these are, we're returning skews, so we don't have to cast this. But if we're want to return an array of integers, we can always do this array map and pass in the callback of an int val. And it will cast every one of these to an integer. And we can also do, if we want, an array filter with no callback, which will filter out empty values. So right there, we are eliminating empty values, and we are casting everything else to an integer. So that can be a nice way to also clean up the code that you are adding into a resource model. All right. Yep. So hopefully this makes sense as far as uses for the resource model. And then finally, the repository. So the goal is to make it so that you don't have to worry about or look at what is happening in the database layer. That is all completely separate. All you need to do and all you really ever need to care about is calling the resource models, the repository, get by ID, get list, save, and delete. That's really all you have to do. However, and I wish it was that simple, but it's not, because the repositories are can notoriously be poorly performing, and we'll talk about why that is here in 1 second. I do want to make a call out here as far as debugging queries. So when you are working with a select, and in this case, you saw me working with a select, which is the Magento Framework DB select. Every one of these has a, let's see here, has a return select. Come on, there we go. Has a toString method, and I think that's under the Zen DB select. There we go. This is absolutely critical whenever you're working with queries. Is this double underscore toString magic method? And what that ends up doing is well, you see right here, this assemble, and it assembles the query, and you can of course call it any way that you want, but well, you can add your own methods to this, so you can, I don't know, add extra logic. In fact, the Magento staging, that's how it works, or content staging, that's how it works, is it adds the for the any staging enabled entities, it adds the version ID column in there. I think it's the version ID column into this to select and make sure that you're selecting the correct version. So the way to do that is call the _toString. You could do that, but the easiest way is just to cast it to a string. Cast one of these select objects to a string, and then you're home free. You got your query that you can now go drop in your browser, your query MySQL browser of sorts, whether that's SQL Ace or PHP/MyAdmin, whatever you're using. Drop it in there, and you can edit it to your heart's content. Super, super easy. Absolutely. Dan said, yep, using that toString is a lifesaver, and it is indeed a lifesaver. Now, if you are going a little bit deeper and are having an issue, I am embarrassed to say this, but I literally found out a couple weeks ago about this other command to the dev query log enable and disable. I literally found out about that a few weeks ago. Now, it will barf so many queries at you, it's not even funny. So you're gonna have to be prepared to sort through hundreds of queries in a request. That said, it is incredibly helpful to see exactly what is happening in the database. So it's kind of like calling the toString method on a select. It's like calling that, but for an entire request. So again, very helpful, but you're going to get a lot of queries output, and certainly make sure you do not have this enabled on production. To be frank, I've used it once, I think. Well, once in the last few weeks. So it's not necessarily something you want to turn on all the time or use it. You should be using Xdebug, which brings me to a quick little point that I want to mention, and that is, if you haven't already, make sure that you do purchase this book, The Art of Ecommerce Debugging. I've gotten so many great feedbacks about this. We talk about debugging, we talk about the database, we talk about using Xdebug for sure. That's really important. I had a really cool testimony I got the other day, and this person has 8 years of experience. So we could all blame Magento, and I get that. Like, there's definitely some people out there that do. But at the end of the day, I think a good portion of that comes down to, hey, let's learn about these strategies we can employ that will save us tremendous amounts of time. And the Art of Ecommerce Debugging does just that. So it makes me very excited, because my goal is to help you all as developers. I had a conversation recently with somebody, and they were like, well, is there any discount on the book? And I was like, no, because I'm shipping this book. Well, it was specifically someone in India. I'm shipping this book for free to India, and that costs, I think you run the numbers, I think it's like $26 to $28 to ship it over to India. So you run the numbers, at the end of the day, $40 minus $26 does not leave much room for printing, fulfilling, all that other stuff. And to be frank, I'm not making much, if any, money off these book sales. So my goal, and I say that to show my goal is to help you all. Yes. Good point. Simon said be prepared to use grep. Yes, you absolutely must do it. Use grep. Very, very important for the query log. Or you can pipe it out to, yep, exactly. Okay, very good. So let's talk about some database performance. I said I would, and I missed my halfway mark. So you have to bear with me, and we might talk about, we'll just move whatever I didn't get covered here today. We'll move that off into November, because I have something special we'll talk about in October. Very excited about that. So again, I have this beef with the product repository, a very deep problem with it. But the thing that I've been thinking about is, why is it so slow? Add attribute to select, basically asterisk, is used to select products. And I will show you that. Let's see here. I'll pull it up here. One thing it's very critical to do is be cognizant of what's actually happening. Don't just write product repository get by ID or product repository get or get list. Just, okay, that's what I'm supposed to do. Be asking yourself the question, is this the best way that I possibly can do this? And maybe the answer is yes. Maybe the answer is no. But look at this right here. Our get list collection get attribute to select asterisk right there. Right there. It is. There's an asterisk there. Every single attribute is loaded, and there's absolutely no reason for that. So that's my issue number one. But secondly, and this is much harder to get around, that the module vendors indiscriminately slap performance trashing plugins on this product repository. There's just not much way to get around that, unfortunately. But we want to do whatever we can do to possibly get this. So Ivan, one thing that kind of comforted my soul and my spirit about this, Ivan Shaperny, brilliant person when it comes to performance in Magento, said this: the issue is not the ORM you use, but it's the use of the ORM itself. As the database should never be designed around your object model, you never need a full object to show a product price in the product listing. ORMs promote fat objects. So it's kind of like a paradigm shift here. What I'm suggesting and what I'm encouraging is don't use a sledgehammer or a semi-truck when a motorcycle, or when a small ballpoint hammer or a motorcycle will get the job done. We don't necessarily always need the full object. And again, it's being cognizant of what is important, what is necessary, how is this supposed to happen. At that point, we say, okay, well, do we need most of the attributes? Well, if we do, well, yeah, use the product repository, absolutely. Or if the product repository has already been loaded, use it. Or the product has been loaded from product repository. Great examples on the PDP, the product display page. The product repository has already been used because most of the attributes are necessary for this. But if you're like some people, and some of the mega menus that I've seen, they use the category repository to load every single category in that is shown in the mega menu. And that's just downright awful, if I could say it in those terms, because I've seen it a lot of times. And then, of course, they say, well, just make sure you have caching turned on. Okay, if we can write performant code in the first place, then we don't have to worry about caching as much. Yes, caching is still helpful, but my thought is caching can be a awful Band-Aid, and let's work to avoid it. So here's the thing. Why do we need to access their product repository? I see two reasons. Well, two things that we don't need to access it. And to be frank, this covers the majority of reasons that we would be using the product repository. Number one, we rarely need all the attributes. Number two, we certainly don't need all the plugins. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. It's a matter of deciding what is the best in the situation. I pulled a little sample off of GitHub where this person is loading in the name, status, and SKU for a given product. And that is after calling get product repository get list. So every plugin is run on this. Every attribute is loaded, even though at the end of the day, all we need is 3 attributes. That's all we need. And so, man, then yeah, I have to say, good point. Yes, saying the mega menu extension, query problem, for loop. Yeah, I don't know if I've seen that specific one, but I've seen some really bad mega menus, really, really bad for performance. And actually, here is an example from the Magento core code. This, the Elasticsearch resource model index, get full category and product index data. And this is probably one of the most egregious examples of category repository being used in Magento itself. When indexing, it's calling the category repository just to get the category's name. Now, how do we overcome this? We can do this. Wow, that's weird. I think I might be... I think I deleted some slides as I was cleaning stuff up. Oh, great. Okay. Well, we'll go at this from a different perspective. Yes, I did delete some slides. Okay, and those are unrecoverable now. Wonderful. Congratulations. Okay. So, what we need to do is let me get my thoughts back together. So, there's a couple of perspectives things that we can do. First, if we look at the product, see our Magento. Let me make sure so you can see my screen. Magento catalog model resource model product. There is this method, and I'm going to go to the abstract resource, which means that it also covers the categories. Get is it raw? I'll just search for raw. There we go. This method right here is your very best friend for getting a single attribute value for a given object, or for a given product, for example, product or category. all you do is you pass in the entity ID. This does have to be the entity ID. You can't pass in the SKU, but it's very easy to use well, let me just show you this. Product lookup. I think I have one in here. Yes, I do. Let's just pull this one up and see if I have it here. Yeah. Get row ID from SKU. So I have this, and I'm intending to get this utilities module out, which has a number of very helpful resource models in there. But all we have to do is we're working with a SKU, and personally, I find myself more and more using SKUs as opposed to product IDs anymore. So we can convert from a SKU to an ID and an ID to a SKU right here in this location. So super easy to do it right here. We pass that in for the entity ID. We pass in our attribute string, the name of our attribute, and then the store. And you can pass in 0 if you don't have a store available, but in many cases we do have a store available. You can use Store Manager to get the current store ID. Pass it in. Magento fetches this information out and returns it back to you. So super simple, and we're able to get these. And let's see here. I think it's just a couple. If the attribute is then cached, so it could be. I think it's even as low as 1 query, maybe 2 queries to get this out. There's a join in there, so I think it is 1 query to get this information out if the attribute has already been loaded. So that's really super simple. So yeah, that's all we have to do. Call it get raw attribute. Value, I think, very, very simple. The other thing we can do is use the collection. The collection, as we see here in product repository, is we have it's loading in a collection in itself. So if we need to fetch just a couple of values, we pass in this, we can create a collection ourselves and pass in whatever attributes we want to select. And yeah, that's super simple as well. Now that said, I am working on, and it's an alpha, and I had a whole slide on this too, which is I'm bummed about. But I'm working on what I call a fast product repository. And I will be again sharing this with our Slack group. So just make sure, my friends, you have gone to swiftauto.com/Slack. You'll be able to get yourself freely into our community. 1,300 members strong, great questions, great answers. My goal is it's like the good Magento Stack Exchange. You know, you go to Magento Stack Exchange, you get some shaky answers, and you never know, especially for a junior developer, whether the answer is going to be good or not. Well, my goal is our Slack community, you are guaranteed to get good answers. Just what it is, because there's some wonderful people. Dan, Simon, they're the two names that I recognize here in our conversation on this Slack channel, and they are brilliant developers. So make sure you are on that group, swiftauto.com/Slack. So I have created this fast product repository, and the goal is it's more or less a drop-in replacement for, as closely as possible, drop-in replacement for the existing Magento product repository. The only thing that it does is it ends up adding a new array to the end of this, again, to make it as transparent as possible to allow us to be able to select attributes. If you pass in a empty array, that's going to call the original Magento product repository. But if you pass in a list of attributes here that you want to select, it will fetch a product with just those attributes. Now, the cool way that this works is it's additive. So if you want, for example, the name on round 1, you say get by ID, you pass in the name. Well, maybe the next go around in the future, you want the price. Well, you pass in the price attribute, and it will load in just that price attribute and save that information. Now you load in, then you say, okay, well, actually in the future, another time you want in the, Joseph. Yeah, Joseph Leedy's on there too. Thank you. I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. Yes, Joseph Leedy's another brilliant person in our Slack community. I'm super honored to have all of you guys there. But you say, okay, now I want name and price in the future. Well, name and price have already been loaded in, and so it's going to immediately return that back to you. So it's very additive. And of course, if you do call the get method with no attributes, it loads it into the product repository, and this is smart enough to see that, there already is all the attribute values available. We're not going to go back and load in all this anymore. So it's very possible. It's very easy to manage this in a much more fluid manner. All right. So Dan said, can we do something like a like and array of attributes the first time? So basically, like the like would be a search criteria builder, and then the array of attributes would be that. And yes, I believe that is possible, although I don't think I've specifically tested that situation, but I think that does work. So it's quite a lot of code to be able to make this happen. Of course, it's fully tested with integration testing and all that. Here is a quick little sneak peek. And I will be sharing this out here shortly so that you all can provide your thoughts as far as how this works. I have 5 more minutes, and so I'm trying to mentally work through, especially since I deleted my slides, what I want to talk about. And I think that one of the most valuable things I can talk about here is the collection processor. So if you're creating your own repository, you should be using, at least have this collection processor in here. For example, let's see here. I've created a number in this project that will be included in the Art of Ecommerce Debugging course. I've created a repository in here and have a collection processor. So we have our collection, our location print method collection, and then we have our collection processor that sits on top of that. It takes the search criteria and converts it into add field to filter, etc. on our collection. But what's especially fascinating is how this processor works. And what I see here is when we call this, and it's super simple to call, super simple to add in. Actually, one thing I should call out is we inject collection processor. Magento likes to abstract this out. You can abstract it out and add other processors in for specific classes. Look at the CMS page repository. It's a great example of this. But our collection processor interface has a default preference for the collection processor. So if I remember correctly, we don't even need to specify any preference for that. Let me just double check here. Yeah, I don't think we do. So yeah, we just inject collection processor interface, and that's how we get our collection processor, which again takes a search criteria and applies it to a given collection. The collection must extend abstract collection. So coming in here, we have multiple filters or multiple processors. So we can join processor, pagination processor, all of these different processors, but I want to focus on the filter processor. The filter processor is interesting because while it does what we would normally think it to do, at the end of the day, we see it call here add field to filter. We can also call it also has a method add get custom filter for field, which refers back to a custom filters array, which we see comes up to custom filters, which expects a type of custom filter interface. Custom filter interface, we can implement this as new filters for ourselves. In a case, well, again, going back to the CMS page repository, the page repository needs to filter by store ID, for example. Well, they created a filter for that specifically. And I can probably pull that up very quickly here. Magento CMS. All right, here. Use this store block filter as on the block, but same concept. And it's called the collection add store filter. So this I found is incredibly helpful, especially on the admin when working with UI components. And we want to affect how a column is filtered. Maybe it's joined in using or maybe we are using a group on a query, and we want to, instead of calling add field to filter, we want to use the having statement. At that point, then yes, we definitely would need to create ourselves our own filter. So this is really handy. I don't reach for it all day, every day, but it's a way of setting you free of having to work within the Magento constraints, and instead we're able to create something custom. Another great use case would be if you are working to create, working to create an integration within an ERP. The ERP is pinging Magento. And instead of creating this really long search criteria statement, all you want is you want to shorten it down, pass in some abbreviated information, and then you use this filter on the Magento side to extrapolate that information in whatever way would be necessary. Okay, so one final thing I wanted to quickly show you is breaking down the collection, how a collection loads information from the database. This is most helpful to understand when it comes to, I should have set a breakpoint here. This is most helpful to understand when it comes to extension attributes. And I found a number of times when I've not hooked into the right spot with extension attributes, and that's caused me problems specifically on the collection. So I'm going to set a breakpoint here, a little CLI command, and we're going to see exactly how this works and what happens here. So in this case, we have a location print method collection factory, which then proceeds into for each. Now, this is where call it magic methods can really get us into trouble, because we look at this and say, well, where is these rows coming from? Maybe it's coming from the collection. I don't know. Well, this is where in Xdebug, step into is incredibly helpful. We can step into F7 on my computer, on a Mac. I don't remember what it is on Windows. So we step in here and it comes to this get iterator. So ultimately for each calls get iterator, which returns a new array iterator or iterates over the items. But first, this load is called. This load checks to see if it's loaded, and then it steps over and jumps into load with filter. Now, if you are writing a plugin to, say, attach some extension attributes to a list of items that were just loaded from the database, I will say this: do not attach your plugin to the load method. Do not use after load or before load. Instead, use after or before load with filter. You see, because this would be called every single time we call load. And depending on the usage of this collection, we might call load 5 times. We might iterate over this 5 times, which will ultimately call load 5 times. Instead, we call load with filter, and if it's already been loaded, our database, our queries will only run 1 time. Before loads, it's getting our query ready, print log query, okay. This get data, let's step in here. If the data is null, render filters again. All right, so this gets select. Now, so here's what I was saying earlier. I'm going to cast this, get select to a string, and we have our query here and available. And again, this is a very small query, but you get into some product collections and you will get a very large query. I dealt with this the other day. Algolia was not, products are being dropped from the Algolia index. I traced it back, found it was related to the collection. Turns out the collection, of course, doesn't interjoin with the price index table, and the price index table was empty, and that was due to a bug that we ended up writing into there. We didn't take into account a specific condition, and some rows were being dropped from the product collection because they were not in the price index. So this is what the tool I used over and over again in that troubleshooting to figure this out. So it's going to get this the select, and we see our fetch all is back, and we see this data where is that? There we go. We have 9 rows here, very raw format. Let's see here, step in. Yep, that was just okay. Reset data then for each the data as row, get new empty item. Wow, I messed that up. And this is where the entity factory create. Let's step into this real quick. And there is plugins on here because I'm creating plugins in this project here. All right, this object manager create. So the factory is not called here. So yeah, that can create some problems. We have our after plugins that are called on this. This item add data. This add item, and now we have our collection has been populated. So big takeaway there, use load with filter if you're needing to create a plugin for it. All right, I went a couple minutes over. Any final questions? And again, there's a lot more to talk about, a ton more to talk about, and I look forward to continuing the conversation in November. I will say that our conversation next month will be about GraphQL and getting started in that. What is GraphQL? How does it work, and how can we best leverage it in our applications? And I am super excited to talk about that because, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's not been something I've really delved into. So this next month, it's going to be a month of transformation for me because I'm going to learn all about GraphQL. And I invite you all to come back and we'll talk about GraphQL here the first Wednesday of October. Again, super excited about that. So any final questions before we sign off here today? Any questions? If not, we'll sign off. Yeah, I get that. It's a bit of a nightmare for GraphQL. Yes, it was. And actually, that got me started. I was having a conversation yesterday, and the person said, because we're talking about selecting all attributes versus not, and the person suggested, hey, why don't you look into GraphQL? That's one of the core features of GraphQL. And I agree. And ultimately, GraphQL could be very handy in that way. But at the end of the day, GraphQL is really complex to load and get information out of that. So it's no substitute yet for a product repository. Again, being a more performant version of that. So that's why I've created my own product repository. I'm testing it out. I will be releasing it to everybody here shortly. And then my goal is to create one for categories, customers, and customer addresses. Yes. Very good. Cool. Well, again, if I could invite everybody to come join me over on our SwiftOtter Slack channel, very vibrant community for Magento, customizing it, editing it, dealing with some crazy weird problems. There's been some great problems that people have posted up there, and I think some really awesome solutions to that. So very excited about our community, the progress it's made, and hope that you can join it and to contribute and enrich it as well. What is Willis talking about? Is there a good way to troubleshoot random no such entity exceptions in my log? Oh, thank you. I hope it's a help to you about this book. The stack trace is probably the most helpful thing that you can do in order to troubleshoot no such entity exceptions. So that might mean, and I keep meaning to get this finalized. I have a blog post, not a blog post, more like just a quick cheat sheet of places to set your breakpoint, set breakpoints in your code, or to add extraneous logging so that you can get a little bit more information about some of this stuff. So, that would be my suggestion. See if you can get a stack trace off of that, because the stack trace gives you the map to how we arrived at this problem. It's not always perfect, but it's a very good first step. And feel free to write up a little more information, drop that on our Slack channel. We'd love to take a better look at that in your case. Cool. Awesome. Well, it has been an absolute pleasure to be with all of you today. Thank you for joining on. I hope this has been a help to you. I hope it has been enlightening to you as far as what we are talking about. Oh, yes, I can definitely agree with what Dan is saying here. He says use it because there's a lot of awesome people there, and I couldn't be more proud. Like, I could not be more proud of the people that are in that community. There's no way to overstate my happiness to see such smart, intelligent people in there helping others. It's the spirit of the Magento community found right there in that Slack channel. What else can I say there? So anyways, without me continuing to talk this up, I am very excited to do these. Look forward to next month, and we will continue our conversation specifically on databases, and we're going to get a lot deeper in it. My more basic conversation took a little longer than I thought it was going to take, unfortunately. So we're going to dive much deeper into this in November. So it's been a pleasure having you all here. Talk to you later.